Spring in the Roundtable, former DNC Chair Donna Brazile, former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, and former RNC Chair, Trump White House Chief of Staff Reince Priebus. Chris, let me begin with you. We just saw Elon Musk says the first 100 days are intense. President Trump called it the golden age. How would you sum it up?
Well, it's less for me, but the people of the United States, George. And let's look at just the Fox poll. When Donald Trump got elected, he got elected by independents and some right-leaning Republicans who said they wanted to fix the economy.
They joined on whose base?
That's exactly right. He's got a 38% approval rating on the economy, a 33% approval rating on inflation, along with the lowest approval rating of any president at 100 days. So if that's a golden age for him, I think he's misevaluating things. And of course, now he says, well, the polls are all wrong. The bottom line is this. If he doesn't turn around this tariff policy, if he doesn't fix what's going on in the economy and the instability that we have, everything else that he's doing, by the way, that I agree with some things, like on immigration, I think he's done the right things at the border.
The right things in the right way?
Well, look, I'm not going to get it. It wouldn't be the way I would do it, George, but the results at the border are going to be pleasing to the American people because we don't have tens of thousands of people a day coming over the border. Even on that stuff, no one will care because in the end, what matters in this country more than anything else is the economy. That's why he got elected. When Kamala Harris said that she wouldn't do anything different than Joe Biden in an economy that they thought was too expensive and not enough opportunity for them, they kicked the Democrats out.
Reince, the president was elected on his promises on the economy in large measure, and now we have seen the public flip on that issue, as Chris just pointed out.
Well, I think some of these things Chris is saying are true, but on the other hand, when you look at what the president campaigned on, I've got his 100-day promises, close the border, reinstate remain in Mexico, begin the largest deportation, repeal EV mandate, terminate the Green New Deal policies, implement a 10-to-1 deregulation, create a government efficiency commission. He's doing every single thing he said he was going to do. Now, some people don't like it, but to think that Donald Trump was not going to disrupt the federal government, disrupt our trade relationships by implementing tariffs, he promised it. And the most important screenshot that you put up on that package just earlier was the picture of Kamala Harris. Because you know what? It actually matters who you run against. And it turns out that when Donald Trump laid out his agenda for the American people, which I've said people were looking for the biggest middle finger and they found it, they have a choice to make. And they saw the choice. They saw Kamala Harris. They said, we don't want to go that direction anymore in this country. And you know what? Warren Buffett and all these other guys that have made lots of money on Chinese investments, maybe they don't like it. But you know what? I think it's too bad. But I think eventually we're going to get to the next 100 days, which we are now. And now you're going to see things, tax cuts, rebuilding on the tariff policy. And I just wouldn't judge too early here because I think Donald Trump does have a way of touching the fire and then going back to the drawing board and getting things lined up. And I think that's what he's doing.
Donna, two things missing from Reince Priebus's list, bringing inflation down on his first day, ending the war in Ukraine before he even took office.
Absolutely. Look, we know Donald Trump campaigned on a litany of issues, George, but I think the American people really assumed that the president would put most of his focus on lowering costs, on ensuring that Americans can make ends meet, buy groceries, of course, pay for their rent and gasoline, create jobs, create a future for the American people. He campaigned as a disruptor, but nobody wants a disruptor in chief. They want someone with certainty, someone who can work with our allies, rebuild, from the bottom up. And what we've seen with Donald Trump is something totally different.
Chris, I think you identified the tariffs as the number one issue. Liberation Day, probably the most consequential day of the first 100 days. Is there an exit strategy for Donald Trump on this? We heard Reince Priebus say basically he's going to double down, but can he make this sort of series of deals that limit the damage?
Well, it depends on what those deals look like, George. And I will tell you that if you look at the reaction of the rest of the world, the biggest problem is that the world now sees us as an unreliable partner.
Right.
And Donald Trump, I believe, misevaluated that. I think he thought he could come in and bully them and just say, we're the biggest economy in the world, and you may not like what I'm going to do, but I'm going to do it anyway. What he didn't count on was the effect it's had on the bond market as well. And the problem there is that we're now looking at a real potential for stagflation, to have an economy that is in recession, which we're one quarter towards that now. We had a recessionary report in the last quarter.
Although the job market the report on Friday was pretty solid.
Right, so we'll see, but we'll see whether that translates, George, into GDP growth or not. We don't know whether it will or it won't. We'll see next quarter. I hope it does, because that'd be good for everybody. But in the end, what most economists are now saying, and business leaders are saying, is that we're headed towards stagflation, which we haven't had for a long time. And he didn't run on that.
And Ryan, it's one of the things you talk to business executives over the last several weeks since Liberation Day, and you get the sense that everything is just frozen on the corporate level. People don't know which decisions to make because they don't know where the president's going to land on tariffs and other big issues.
Well, I mean, I think part of that is true, but I think that's what the president is trying to work out with his team at Treasury and Commerce and inside the White House. And so, look, obviously, there's been some disruption. There's been up and down in the market. S&P's recovered all of its losses in April since Liberation Day. And I think what you're going to see is I think you're probably going to see a 10% global tariff across the board, and then you're going to see a focus on China and a deal with China in the next 1 or 2 months. And I think that by the time you get to the summer, look, Donald Trump is not as much interested in being known as great in 50 years. Donald Trump, we know, Chris knows, he wants people to believe he's great right now. He doesn't like to see negative press about the economy. He doesn't like getting letters from folks that he knows in New York about what the tariffs are doing. He's trying to find a balance. And I think that the American people are going to give him a few more months to find that balance. And I think you're seeing some of the results of that balance is starting to be seen by investors because the markets have been coming back.
Donna, Ezra Klein has an interesting analysis in the New York Times talking about the difference between the first and the second Trump term. The first term he was staffed by what he calls inhibitors. Second term he's staffed by what he calls accelerators. We saw that play out this week. One of the people who could have been an inhibitor, Mike Waltz, his national security advisor, out.
Well, he's on his way, I guess, to the UN if the Senate confirms him. And, of course, Marco Rubio has, 12 jobs now, in addition to being the Secretary of State. You know, I just want to raise a red flag about small businesses. They're the engine of our economy, and small businesses are also worried about these tariffs. Farmers are worried about what they're going to plant and what people will be willing to buy and trade and so forth. But there's no question, Donald Trump is surrounded by people who adore him. He wants to, I was watching the cabinet meeting, George, and I'm like, why don't they just give him some chocolate and make him feel good or give him something? But everybody was saying, you're so great. No, what about the American people? What about helping those ordinary people who are struggling to make ends meet? We haven't mentioned federal employees, George. And I live in a neighborhood filled with federal employees. Some of them were told back in February that their jobs had been eliminated, and then in March they come back to work, and now they still don't know where the hell they stand. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty, and it's unnecessary. Donald Trump does not need to lead and govern this way.
Chris, after that Signal Communications scandal, the president didn't want to give a scalp, he said to the media, but we found out a month later Mike Waltz is gone. What was behind that? What do you make of it?
I tell you, I don't think it was the Signal issue, George. I think it was Laura Loomer and the MAGA base who, went in there and dumped a load of dirt on Mike Waltz and the people who worked for him. And I think it was much more that than it was the Signal issue. I think the president didn't care about the Signal issue. Sure, he wasn't happy about it, but I don't think he saw it as a firing offense. And the proof of that is Pete Hegseth is still there, who's the guy who was really ultimately responsible for all the difficult information that got communicated in that Signal chat. I think it's the fact that the president still listens to a lot of these folks who I think most people would not see as credible sources. And on the difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2, the other thing is that he had people in Trump 1 that he was intellectually intimidated by. Gary Cohn at the National Economic Council.
Goldman Sachs.
Right, from Goldman Sachs. You had his Treasury Secretary, Steven Mnuchin, who I think he was intellectually intimidated by. So that when they pushed back, he really listened. The difference now is that he thinks he knows the presidency better than anyone, which he didn't feel like in Trump 1. And secondly, the people around him don't know how and don't have the capability to move him. And so Howard Luck doesn't want to move him.
Commerce
You know, right? He doesn't want to move him. You know, Stephen Miller clearly doesn't want to move him away from what he's doing. And the Treasury Secretary is really the last guy with his finger kind of in the dike. And Ryan's talked about the markets going up. That's because the Treasury Secretary keeps saying, there's going to be deals, there's going to be deals. Yeah. Don't worry about it. And every time he says that, he's got some credibility and the markets come back.
Chris mentioned Stephen Miller, Reince Priebus. Some people saying now that he could be considered for National Security Advisor?
Well, first of all, though, it's just not true that the president didn't do anything. I mean, the president actually signed an executive order and then reversed course and put a 90-day pause on the executive order. So he did do something.
Because the markets dropped, right?
Well,
because
yeah,
the markets dropped.
And he did something about it, okay? Now, as far as Waltz is concerned,
why did he do it in the first place?
The decision on Waltz was made weeks ago. Okay, and I said as much on the air basically about 3 weeks ago. The difference here is that, you know, a rare soft landing, which, you know, obviously doesn't come around very often.
Well, but you said a decision was made weeks ago. Why, in your
much.
view, did he make it?
Well, because I think he was waiting for the right time. Maybe he wanted to think about it. Maybe he was 90% sure, but wanted to see how things go. I think there were things going on there inside the White House that were percolating over time. The Signal Gate came up. That was an accelerant. And I think eventually they made the decision. But as far as Stephen Miller, look, Stephen Miller does push on the president, but he pushes on the president to go back to his 100-day policies that he laid out and say, Mr. President, you said you're going to do X, Y, and Z. Here it is. Let's do it. So, I mean, not all of it's bad. A lot of it can be good. And so I just think there's two ways to look at things.
Don, I want to give you the last word. You know, one of the things we've seen is that Ryan's brought up Kamala Harris. President Trump has been losing altitude. Democrats have not been gaining.
We haven't been gaining, George, in the polls, but you know what is happening right now? There are people across the country who are now looking not just at the Democratic Party, but they're also looking into their own local leaders to stand up, to rise up. And it's ordinary veterans and ranchers and farmers that are doing the talking for the Democratic Party. Democrats are in a stronger position today because they are unified.
Thank you all very much.